Hi, good evening. In the last lecture, we have examined the society of the 7th century in Italy and the Edict of Rodari, the best source of information on it. If you had not watched the last video, you might wish to do that before you start with this one, because the two videos will cover just one subject, the life under the Lombard domination in Italy. After dealing with the laws of the Lombards, it is now time to see how they were applied. This will tell us a lot about the Middle Ages. In order to decide who was right, Lombard judges made use of practices no longer employed by modern courts: oaths, judicial combats, and ordeals. We tend to have clear-cut views about those ways of reaching verdicts today. To put our hand into boiling water does not seem a good way to defend ourselves from an accusation. However, the ordeal remained a widespread practice for many centuries in Italy because there was a rationale behind it, which needs to be seen within the social context of the times. Certainly, the adoption of the ordeal was a long step back with respect to Roman law. Roman law moved from the assumption that the magistrate would have normally been able to reach the truth by means of his rationality. Therefore, it provided him with a procedure for ascertaining the facts which had originated the legal procedure. His inquiry and the process consisted in finding out whether those facts had taken place or not, and how. His verdict, a word that literally means pronunciation about the truth, was a statement about those facts, not about other facts which had taken place at a later stage, like a duel, or the burns caused to someone who had been clenching a red-hot iron bar. The Lombard judge, however, had a different mindset than his Roman predecessor. He didn't proclaim to be right those who could demonstrate their innocence, but those who, having completed certain steps of a procedure, were assumed to be innocent on the basis of postulates of religious or rather of magical nature. One of them was that nobody would be so crazy to incur the hostility of the gods or to damn his soul by committing perjury. Another postulate was that the gods would not tolerate the victory of a felon in a duel. The transition from paganism to Christianism didn't alter the relevance of these assumptions implicit in the barbarians' justice system. Those meta-juridical postulates remain the basis for courts' pronunciations in a more essential way than the laws themselves. Let's first have a look at the oath. The Edict of Rodari provided for a certain number of coniuratores, or sacramentales, who supported with their oaths the plaintiff and or the defendant. Their number depended on the importance of the case. The highest number was 12 people in total. However, unlike the witnesses of a modern process, who are relevant only for the direct knowledge of the fact to be ascertained, the coniuratores didn't take their oath on whether the fact had happened or not. They swore about their belief in the innocence of the defendant, irrespective of their knowledge of the facts. They were frequently relatives of the people they supported, and the value of their oaths consisted in exposing themselves to the wrath of God if they lied. It was this exposure that weighed on the verdict of the judge. One could say that in some way the ideal of what had happened had to influence the oath of the coniuratores, a Latin term meaning those who swear with, and that therefore the truth managed to emerge anyway in the court. However, even a well-meaning even well-meaning conjuratores had few chances to gain an objective view of the people they supported. In the Italy of the 7th century, people lived among their families and clans in small, isolated communities, often surrounded by forests. The results were inevitably expression of the loyalty that family bonds commanded. In other words, the conjuratores were precisely those relatives that, in a feud, would have turned out arms in hand to wash an offense with blood. It was therefore probably frequent that, even after such oaths had been taken, the judges went for a judicial duel before issuing his verdict, or that after a verdict had been based solely on oath had been issued, a feud was eventually unleashed. Therefore, a more conclusive procedure was required. If a person committed perjury, provoking thereby the wrath of the gods, or consigning his soul to the fire of hell, those consequences were invisible to the community, of course. What people needed instead was that the divine presence on which the procedure was based manifested itself in some way, ending the controversy once for all. This was the reason for the tradition of the ordeal, of which the judicial combat was a special case. Those practices were, like the Weregil that we have seen last time, a response to a precise social need. By making apparent the decision of the gods, they could finally free a tribal society from the crippling burden of the feuds. With respect to the feuds, ordeals, and judicial combats, confine the effect of a crime or a controversy to within a circle of only a few people. In a trial by combat, a champion would possibly fight for someone unfit to do it, but apart from him, other people were not involved. They could only acknowledge the outcome of the ordeal. The combat normally followed the oaths and was made in confirmation of them. Originally, the judges resorted to it only for important matters, but its use must have become fairly widespread if the Edict of Rotary requires it, even in case of simple insults, whenever the offender refused to pay a composition and to swear in public that his insult did not correspond to the truth. The outcome of a duel relieved the judge from responsibilities and from the inconveniences of disappointing a powerful clan. When the magistrate required a duel, this took place outdoors, on a wide area enclosed by ropes, around which the crowd gathered and watched the combat in perfect silence, as required by the law. Women, elderly and sick people, as well as members of the clergy, needed a champion to defend them in such combats. The church was initially not favorable to the judicial combats, because they usually caused the death of one or even sometimes of both contenders. In practice, however, the church benefited from them. Since the clergy was exonerated from combats, abbots and bishops paid professional duelists whose intervention scared potential plaintiffs even before the start of a legal dispute. The limitation of the number of people involved in a legal procedure was even more drastic when the demonstration of someone's innocence did not foresee any human adversary. This proof of one's innocence could be more or less dangerous, more or less difficult to pass, more or less excruciating, according to local tradition. It could, for instance, consist in the suspect taking an oath about his innocence in front of the corpse of the victim and in touching it without causing it to bleed again. A more challenging test required the defendant to be tied up and thrown into the water. Sinking was a sign of innocence. Floating meant that the water refused to receive the sinner who had committed the crime. Occasionally, a piece of wood with the suspect name written on it was utilized instead of the suspect himself. Another proof consisted in carrying for 9 steps with one's bare hands a red-hot iron bar. Then the hands of the accused were wrapped and the bandages were removed after 3 days. The healing of those burns would have meant innocence. An even more dreadful ordeal was the transitum per ignes, in which the accused was expected to prove his innocence by walking unscathed through a narrow passage between 2 flaming piles of wood. It was a proof lethal enough to make his capital execution redundant. And so on. There were many kinds of ordeals. The common element was that they could have had, in the imagination of the judge, 2 possible outcomes. Whilst in a judicial combat, the divine presence was, so to say, implicit in the procedure. In those ordeals without any adversary, the presence of God was openly invoked, and the spectators had the impression to witness divine intervention. The person who had to undergo the ordeal was isolated from his clan, both psychologically, because of the uniqueness of his position, and physically, during the few days that preceded it. The official reason for that was the preparation for the person's imminent encounter with God. But in practice, he was segregated from the social context which had generated the controversy or the crime. This separation eased the public acceptance of the outcome of the ordeal and released everyone from any obligation to carry out actions connected to the controversy. Interestingly, the ordeal has been defined a controlled miracle because it consisted in a series of ritual steps whose formality was the guarantee for its validity. Its efficacy in circumscribing the effects of conflicts turned out to be so great that it obtained the support of the Church, which had initially opposed it, and it continued to be practiced until the 12th century, when it began to be questioned and then gradually abandoned. We are therefore talking about a procedure that remained in force in Italy for about 7 centuries. After a while, the Church began to reinforce and refine the rituals of the ordeal and to manage them almost entirely. We know fairly well those ceremonies, although the records of them date mostly from periods following the Lombard domination. The judge's role consisted mainly in deciding whether, in case the oaths didn't appear conclusive to him, a combat or an ordeal was required, and whether the one who had to undergo the ordeal was the claimant, who could not prove his accusation, or the defendant to clear himself from them. After that, the duty of the magistrate was practically fulfilled. It was increasingly left to the Church to manage the elaborate ritual of the ordeal. The ceremony started with a solemn invocation to God that he intervened in the proof and made his judgment apparent. The accused's hair was often shaved. He was dressed only with a long shirt and kept under watch. For 3 days his diet and lifestyle were those of a monk rather than those of a layman, in order to avoid that any sin could interfere with the ordeal. People checked that he didn't carry amulets or talismans. The priest sprinkled him with holy water, and the people comforted him with their prayers. During this preparation, the accused was no longer part of the controversy between human groups. The controversy had, so to say, coagulated entirely in his person as he moved forward to meet God. would talk by the outcome of the ordeal. Thanks to this segregation of the defendant from the rest of the community, everybody could eventually accept the outcome of the ordeal without feeling obliged to undertake any further action. Everybody had become only a spectator, even the judge, whose function at that point was more or less that of a notary, simply acknowledging the outcome of the ordeal and, in case, ordering the sanctions prescribed by the law. On the day set for the ordeal, the defendant arrived, accompanied by the crowd, on the area in front of the church, the most important place for the community to gather during the Middle Ages. Here he was met by the priest, who pronounced solemn formulas forbidding entrance to the church to all those who, having committed a crime or knowing who had committed it, wouldn't confess it. It was a last try, pursued by threatening excommunication and by evoking the terrors of the Last Judgment, to replace the ordeal with a confession. Then the priest indicated the place where the ordeal had to be carried out and the tools to be used, and he blessed them. For instance, the cauldron and the water into which the accused would put his hand. The purpose of this ceremony was to exclude that someone could later on talk about demonic influences, in case the ordeal didn't provide the outcome he desired. But it was also another way to delay the ordeal itself, in the hope to elicit a confession of those who knew about their faults. After that, everybody reached back to the church. A mass started, during which the accused took the Holy Communion. This was another heavy step for a guilty man, because it implied committing sacrilege on the body of Jesus Christ. At the end of the judgment mass, everyone went solemnly back to the place chosen for the ordeal. The priest carried the gospel, preceded by the cross, by the censer, and by the relics of saints, and followed by the crowd singing the litanies foreseen for the ritual. Once there, the priest blessed again with specific prayers which have been preserved through the centuries, the water, by then already boiling in the cauldron suspended over the fire. With his thurible, the priest moved around the cauldron and implored this object to signal by its movement or by the particularly furious boiling of the water whether the accused was guilty. This was the very last try to avoid the dreadful moment in which the accused had to put his hand into the boiling water. Sometimes the proof stopped there because the people managed to read God's judgment from the fact that the cauldron had moved or not. If it was impossible to draw a conclusion, the accused plunged his hand into the water and took it out immediately, while the crowd watched the effects. Well, this was one of the things I had in mind when I said at the start of the last lecture that we would need to face up to barbarity in our little journey through the 7th century. During the last lecture, we have seen how the 7th century in Italy gives us a picture of economic depression due to the generalized insecurity and to the decline of the population. It also shows us a society in which the possession of civil rights coincided with those of weapons, i.e. with the exercise of violence. On this hard background, the Edict of Rodari was a progress. In spite of slavery, of violence, or superstition, we need to evaluate the laws of the Lombards on the basis of the 76 years of darkness that had preceded the edict, not only with respect to Roman law, even if Roman law is better known to us and would make an obvious benchmark for comparison. Firstly, The edict was an answer to the feud, curse of tribal societies of all times. Let's not forget that even during the 20th century, in one of the few areas of Italy where the Lombards never ruled, feuds going on for decades have provoked hundreds of deaths. Furthermore, Lombard justice must have had a brutal effectiveness, if, as a general rule, a process was expected to reach its conclusion within 12 days from the fact that originated it. Exceptions were possible, if justified by procedural needs, but this rule tells us how quickly a verdict was expected to be reached, an immense difference with today's situation in Italy, where processes drag on for decades. It was, of course, a justice that protected effectively only the lives and property of the Lombards. For a long time, the inhabitants of Italy were either slaves or aldi. They were disposable, and for over a century at least, the Lombards couldn't have cared less about their protection. They were only indirectly protected by the law, and namely by the size of monetary sanctions. As I said last time, those sanctions were very, very high. They amounted to hundreds of solidi for an homicide of a free man, for barring the road to a free woman, for the appropriation of other people's property, or for the violation of a tomb to steal objects, which the Lombards, as other Germanic people, used to bury with the dead. Nevertheless, the idea that even a murder could be solved with a simple payment does not correspond to our modern sense of justice. And, on the other hand, it was also unacceptable for Roman law, although Roman law knew compensations, of course. In spite of the unquestionable deterrence value of the weregild, once this had been paid, also with the help of the family of the perpetrator, the consequences of the act were completely extinguished. Even the author of the most heinous crimes was instantly back as fully entitled representative of the society. Another element that conflicts with our modern feelings is that the sanction was mainly determined by the damage caused and did not reflect the difference between a willful act and an unintentional one, or by aggravating or mitigating circumstances. Modern justice systems treat in different ways, for instance, manslaughter with respect to first-degree murder. However, in the 7th century, beside the justice system of the Lombards, a different system was starting to take shape, that of the medieval church. The church had jurisdiction on the clergy, on the population living in the area of Rome, and on all those who had sought its protection by taking refuge in churches or in monasteries. We know how the ecclesiastical justice worked mainly by the penitential books, which set penances for the various sins. One of the oldest ones preserved was written by St. Columba. The church was obviously not interested in the death of the perpetrator of a crime, but in the salvation of his soul, and this salvation could only be achieved after a personal journey that necessarily required time, because it required a great change in the views and even in the personality of the criminal. However, unlike the Lombard kings and dukes, the church had places in which this spiritual itinerary, that was at the same time expiation of the crime, could be completed. The large monasteries of the Middle Ages. A prerequisite for starting this trail of redemption was the full admission of one's sins and the public manifestation of repentance for the sorrow caused. Furthermore, the person who had been accused of a crime was required to forgive publicly everyone for all the wrongdoings he had received in his life. Only after those preliminary steps he could start an itinerary that could have reconciled him with the society. This itinerary normally included a long detention in a monastery. This was no holiday. It was a hard regime of fasting and prayers which could last for several years. The goal of the church was neither a revenge for the harm inflicted by the criminal, nor some kind of compensation or satisfaction for the victims of the crime. The goal was to recover a soul before it was too late. It was to cure a human being from his sins before reconciling him with God and the Christian community. The European justice system, based on the concept of rehabilitation of the criminal, were profoundly influenced by this conception, which explains the horror with which most European citizens regard capital punishments or life sentences. Although the overwhelming majority of Italy's population in the 7th century was not subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction, with the conversion of the Lombards to Catholicism, everybody was exposed to the penances imposed by the confessors. It was not like today that the absolution precedes the penance. So, by means of those penances, a new conception started to penetrate in individual consciences. The view that, by imposing the payment of the wergild for a crime, the state was purely protected those offended by it, but not clearing the offender from his sin, and that the offender could be reconciled with the society only after his repentance and expiation. Justice became thereby also a moral fact, not purely a monetary one, nor simply an issue of public order. The penance required by the Church forced the offender to reflect on what he had done, and created the preconditions for remorse, which concerned not only the criminal act, but also the intention to perpetrate it, in itself a sin for the Church. Furthermore, the penitential books stress very much the distinction between deliberate acts and involuntary ones, a common feature of modern justice systems. These developments were gradual and not apparent. They were not marked by great events, but we can't ignore them in analyzing the transformation that took place in the society during the Middle Ages. In examining the Edict of Rothari, we have focused our attention on certain elements: its source, its language, its structure, the social classes it describes, the economic life, and the mentality of the people in the background. But there's another element that allows us to detect the changes that were taking place in the society of the Lombards. In the prologue of his edict, King Roderick explains the reason why he desired to give written laws to his people. The reasons were, so wrote Roderick, the relentless suffering of the poor, as well as the exaction of those in power, and because of whom, as we learned, the poor is being abused. And he added, we wish that all be included in a single book, in order that everyone will be able to live peacefully within law and justice, and with this certainty to commit himself in the fight against the enemy and in defending himself and his country. Isn't that a great example of clarity and straight talking? So, Rothari issues his edict having in mind impoverished Lombards, exposed to the oppression of powerful people. This tells us that the society had changed very much since the invasion of Italy. As we had seen in the 6th lecture of this cycle, when the Lombards arrived in Italy, they were organized in fare, group of families. They were also military units with tasks of combat, provisioning, and occupation of the territory. The fare provided for the needs of their members by exactions and plunder, As the Lombards could have been exposed to the risk of counterattacks, they initially occupied easy defendable places where nobody lived, or which the terror they inspired emptied of other inhabitants. With the time, however, the Lombards requisitioned most of the land, which became initially property of the Fare, but was eventually fractioned between single families in order to ensure that it was properly attended. So the Lombards spread through the country or gathered in small villages, which weakened the cohesion of the Fare. Although a Lombard man was bound to his Fara and was forbidden to move away from it, the many family units that composed the Fara could no longer live close to one another. They scattered on the lands that ensure their sustenance, and they settled in, inevitably. In general, the Lombard freeman of the 7th century lived with his family, his aldi, his slaves, and his animals in a sort of farm, the curtis, enclosed by fences of ownership marks of some kind. By the time of Roderick, the economy was formed by a web of relatively small farms, largely self-sufficient, whose properties were guarded by the edict. Still in the second half of the 20th century, before the nice surroundings of Milan were submerged under layers of concrete and asphalt, the local farmers still called their farm corte, curtis, as I remember from the times when I was young, a young boy. During the decades that followed the conquest, the division of land and the settlement of the nomadic warriors increased the social difference among them. Some of them, more capable or more lucky, became landowners, others remained simple farmers, and others lost their means of sustenance. The edict wished to maintain social peace and, as King Roderick said very well, to ensure that everyone felt protected enough by the state to be able to defend his country. These are stipulations for a people who had by then solid roots in the territory. The martial collectivism of the time of the conquest had vanished, although a few articles of the edict still remind of it. A more complex society had been forming in Italy, with its contrast and its individual controversies that require a legal system. Italy was starting very slowly to recover from the invasion. Now that we have an idea of the society of the Lombards, let's briefly examine the events of the second part of the 7th century. Roderick died in 652, a victorious king and a wise legislator, an example for his successors. He didn't manage to create a dynasty. His son, Rodoald, who became king after him, was murdered only a few months later by the husband of one of his lovers. Following his assassination, a new king was elected, Aripert, son of a brother of Queen Theodelinda, a choice that brought the so-called Bavarian dynasty back into power. As we said in the course of the 6th lecture, Theodelinda was the daughter of a king of the Bavarians, a Catholic people. She had done a great deal to promote Catholicism, and Aripert promoted as well in a more aggressive way. Paul the Deacon wrote that Aripert got rid of the Arian heresy, which is a vague expression, but he was not the only one to say something like that. We know for sure that the Archbishop of Pavia, the capital of the Lombard Kingdom, went from Arianism to Catholicism. Shortly before his death, in 661, Aripert made the mistake to divide the kingdom between his two sons, Perctarit, who went to live in Milan, and Godepert, who made of Pavia his residence. As the history of the Merovingian king shows, we will deal with that in one of the next lectures, Aripert, Those divisions among sons of the king risked to trigger civil wars. This kind of succession was unique in Lombard history, but it was nevertheless disastrous, because it provoked very quickly a war between the two brothers. At this point, Godepert requested the help of the Duke of Benevent, Grimoald. Grimoald had a tragic history behind him, famously narrated by Paul the Deacon in his Historia Langobardorum. It is a story that conveys the spirit of the times. The father of Grimoald had been Gisulf, Duke of Cividale, we talk about him when we talk about, in Lecture 6, we talk about King Alboin, who promoted his young shield-bearer and cousin Duke of Cividale in order to take this important city close to Italy's eastern border. Gisulf had ruled for many years, but had eventually a contrast with King Agilulf. The king called the Avars to wipe out his opponent without the needs of a civil war. The Avars were raiders of Asiatic origin, often assimilated to the Huns in medieval texts. Their hordes overflowed the area of Cividale and besieged the fortified city. Gisulf fell in one of the first battles against them. At this point, the wife of Gisulf, maybe in the hope to save herself and her children, mindful of the Lombard custom to marry the wife of a defeated ruler, sent a message to the Khan of the Avars that she would open the city gates if he agreed to marry her. It was a fatal mistake. The Khan agreed, and while the Avars plundered the city, he spent a night with the widow of Gisulf, but then he passed her to his chieftains, who raped her during the second night, and on the following day the Khan had her impaled for her betrayal of her people. The Avars set fire to the looted city. In order to speed up the evacuation of the terrified inhabitants, they told them that they would bring them to Pannonia, where the Lombards used to live a few decades before. However, after reaching a field outside the city, they set about to slay all the adult males, as the Avars were only interested in keeping women and children as the slaves. At this point, the three eldest sons of Gisulf, having understood what was about to happen, caught the opportunity to try to flee on horses, as they were sure that their youngest brother Gisulf, would not be able to ride a galloping horse. They decide to kill the child in order to spare him the awful fate of a slave. As one of the brothers raised his word, the crying child begged him to spare him, assuring that he would be able to keep himself on a horse. So they put the child on another horse and fled, soon pursued by the Avars. Grimoald, the child, managed to ride without a saddle, but being slower than his brothers, he was eventually captured by an Avar, who, considering him a harmless child, placed him on his own horse behind himself and started to ride back to the place where the adult males of Cividale were being slain. But Grimoald, who, as Paul the Deacon wrote, had a small sword but great courage, hit the Avar on the skull with his small weapon, killing him instantly. And he then fled, eventually reaching his brothers, while all his sisters were taken away by the Avars, never to be seen again. Of the four brothers, The eldest two were subsequently killed in a Byzantine ambush. But the other two brothers managed to reach Benevento, welcomed by Duke Arequis, who had been their tutor many years before in Cividale. With the time, both brothers became dukes of Benevento, first Rajuald, and then, after his death, Grimoald. Grimoald proved his talent of military commanders by defeating a Greek expedition. We don't know whether it was made of Byzantine troops or of pirates. This Byzantine expedition was on its way to plunder the sanctuary dedicated to the Archangel Michael on Mount Garganus in Apulia. The tragic events that had marked the youth of Grimoald had therefore their origin in the Bavarian dynasty. It had been the husband of Queen Theodelinda, Agilulf, who had called the Avars in Italy to get rid of Grimoald's father, Isulf. And now, another member of the Bavarian dynasty, Godebert, had requested Grimoald's help. Grimoald marched on Pavia with his troops. During a meeting, he stabbed Godebert and took control of the city. Godebert's brother, Perctarit, who had his court in Milano, as we said, fled immediately from Milan, and Grimoald found himself master of the Lombard kingdom in the north of Italy. A bold and resolute man, Grimoald would have soon have plenty of opportunities to prove his fame of military commander. He found himself under a combined attack of colossal proportions. The Franks invaded the north of Italy with the aim to reinstate Perctarit on the throne, while the Byzantines attacked the south of the peninsula. This was no ordinary military expedition. It was the largest Byzantine offensive in Italy since the time of Justinian, and it was led by the emperor himself. In 633, the fleet of Emperor Constans II had landed in Taranto, in Apulia, and had launched an offensive against the Duchy of Benevento. It was a colossal undertaking, which surprised everybody in Italy and in the East as well. Constans II even wanted to transfer his residence to Rome, possibly in order to confront more effectively the immense theater of military operation created in the meantime by the Islamic expansion in the Mediterranean. It was a design, this of Constans, that not even Justinian had envisaged. Constans had been already in power for more than 20 years before he launched his Italian offensive. 20 years during which he had been mostly at war against the Arab Caliphate in the Middle East and in Africa, and against the Slavs in the Balkans. The Byzantine army was immensely experienced, and it quickly gained control over most of Apulia. After that, it converged on Benevento, which Constance besieged, making also use of the elaborate siege engines from the tradition of the Roman army. The Duke of Benevento at that time was Romuald, son of Grimoald. And while his father was busy defeating the Franks in northern Italy, Romuald managed to lead a very long resistance in Benevento until Grimoald could finally move south with his army. As Grimoald's troop neared Constance, afraid of being caught between the approaching army and a sallee of the Lombards in Benevento, decided to drop the siege and retreat on the Byzantine enclave of Naples. He did that, not without coming under an unexpected attack on the river Calore, launched by other Lombard troops who had moved from the city of Capua. Once in Naples, a Byzantine general obtained from Constance the authorization to launch an attack against Romuald. But he suffered a crushing defeat on the way to Benevento. It was a failure from which the Byzantine army would never recover. While Romuald returned to Benevento in triumph, Constance quit Naples and reached Rome. It was the first time that a Byzantine emperor visited Rome since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 2 centuries before. From the city, the Byzantines took everything valuable they could find, including even the bronze tiles of the Pantheon, since long converted into a large church. This was the memory Constance left in the city, for which he had declared that he cared more than for Constantinople itself. After only 12 days in Rome, Constance moved by sea to Syracuse in Sicily. From there he oppressed with his exaction the whole island, together with Sardinia and with the region currently called Calabria. All those areas belonged already to the Byzantines. Constance's army was completely out of the territories he wanted to conquer. The emperor had failed miserably in his endeavor. Ironically, only the demise of Constance made him somewhat resemble to a Roman emperor of the past, to some of the worst ones actually. Seen as a failure by his own military entourage, in 668 Constance was killed by a waiter in his bathroom in the palace of Syracuse. The fiasco of Constance's expedition was followed by other ruinous events for the Byzantines. In Sicily, the military commander, who had proclaimed himself a new emperor after murdering Constance, was not acknowledged as such by the rest of the army and of the empire. He was killed by the troops sent by the Exarchate of Ravenna. The chaos created by those events, profited the Arabs, who had recently gained maritime superiority on the Mediterranean. they managed to carry out successful raids in Sicily, which would later result in the conquest of the whole island. The scale of the Byzantine disaster corresponded to that of Grimoald's and Romuald's triumph. This time it was not an exarch that had paid with his life for attacking the Lombards. It was the emperor himself. He was the overlord behind all the enemies of the Lombards, which had died as a result of this offensive. This marked the final consolidation of the Lombard domination and sealed the end of the empire's power in Italy. To this image of victorious commander, Grimoald added that of legislator by attaching a few articles to the Edict of Rhodri. During his rule, Italy came remarkably close to a reunification. Grimoald's son ruled the Duchy of Benevento and managed to further extend it at the expense of the Byzantines. Furthermore, Grimoald promoted one of his generals, Trasimond, Duke of Spoleto, and let him marry one of his daughters. The three Lombard states of Italy had never been so close. Finally, Grimoald managed to repel the Avars in the sensitive region of Friuli, where he appointed another of his generals, Wecteri, as a duke. In less than 10 years, the man who had so narrowly escaped death and slavery as a child had managed to gain control of nearly all the Italian peninsula. But in 671, at the peak of his power, Grimoald suddenly died by the rupture of a blood vessel poorly treated with the means of the time. Paul the Deacon describes him as a powerfully built man, still strong for his age, bald and with a large beard, quick in his decision and occasionally prone to believe the malicious advice of his courtier, but generous towards those enemies who had shown courage and loyalty to their chiefs. Paul the Deacon also narrates a few episodes of the life of Grimoald. One of them concerns Pertharit, who had fled abroad after Grimoald had killed his brother Godebert. After a couple of years, Pertharit chose to come back, appealing to the clemency of the new king. Grimoald welcomed him in Pavia, but upon the advice of his courtier, he soon changed his mind. However, Pertharit, informed that he was going to be arrested, managed to escape in disguise and reached one of the Frankish kingdoms, where he finds support. When Grimoald died, many years later, Pertharit returned to Pavia and deposed the young heir of Grimoald. He then requested to the Assembly of the Spears the approval for being the new king. The dukes, who had already elected his father Aripert many years before, reaffirmed thereby their role in the choice of the king after about 3 decades. At this point, with Pertharit, the Bavarian dynasty was back in power, and Pertharit started a line of action of strong support to Catholicism, which included the foundation of monasteries and churches in Pavia, capital of the kingdom. Pertharit was not a young man anymore, but his rule lasted for another 20 years. Contrary to Grimoald, he was a peaceful man, made cautious by the fatal dangers he had barely escaped so many times. He always sought peaceful solutions to conflicts. He managed to make an agreement with Romuald, son of Grimoald, by acknowledging the independence of the Duchy of Benevento. The agreement was cemented by a marriage which joined the descendants of Grimoald to those of the descendants of the Bavarian dynasty. Another achievement of Pertharit was the stipulation of a lasting peace treaty with the Byzantines. The empire was thereby forced to legally acknowledge the loss of Italy. This was an undisputable success of the Lombard kings. Pertharit died in 688. Already a few years before, he had, in accordance with Lombard customs, associated Cunibert, his son Cunibert, to his rule. Cunibert found himself confronting then a very serious rebellion, rooted in the dissatisfaction of several dukes with the strong support that the Bavarian dynasty had been giving to Orthodox Catholicism. This kind of political opposition joined pagans, Arians, and adherents to the schism of the three chapters under the command of the Duke of Trento, Alahis. Alahis even managed to banish Cunibert from Pavia and to replace him on the throne as an anti-king. However, following the harsh anti-Catholic policy of Alahis, Cunibert managed to regain the throne with the help of the church, taking advantage of an absence of Alahis from Pavia. Alahis then, with most of his followers, moved east of the Adda River, because he had most of his followers on the northeastern provinces. And he returned with an army for the final showdown with Cunibert. This took place at Coronate, today called Cornate d'Adda, where Alahis fell and his army was defeated in a battle that assumed a religious meaning, a triumph on all the forces opposed to Orthodox Catholicism among the Lombard people. Cunibert added to this victory a great diplomatic success. In the year 698, he hosted a Holy Synod in Pavia, which put an end to the schism of the three chapters, which had been started by the Bishop of Aquileia more than 1 century before. The condemnation of the three chapters heresy completed the adhesion of the Lombards to the religion of Rome. Thereby, one of the elements that had divided the Lombards from the population of Italy had vanished. Both Pertharit and his son Cunibert corroborated stories which saw them object of divine protection in the most dramatic circumstances of their lives. This cemented the bond between the Lombard monarchy and the church, whose support had been crucial to fight against Alahis. the promise made by Alahis to fill up an entire well with testicles of clergymen can be taken as a sign that the Church had clearly taken sides in the rebellion. Several conversions occurred also in the Duchy of Benevento. We have already seen that Grimoald had given great significance to the cult of Archangel Michael after defending his sanctuary on the Gargano from a Greek incursion. Michael, Archangel Michael, became the protector of the Lombards, and his cult would spread in Europe during the following centuries. Grimoald's son, Romuald, who ruled for many years the Duchy of Benevento, consented to the propagation of Catholicism. In the year 700, Cunibert died, revered for his valor and his work of stabilization of the kingdom, on the wake of the previous kings. So, the 7th century ended better than it had started. The Lombards had started to integrate themselves with the people of Italy, and the hardness of their domination started to somewhat relax. At the end of the 7th century, neither the language nor the religion divided anymore the conquerors from their subjects. The practice of mutual support between the monarchy and the church also brought some influential representatives of the church hierarchy in contact with the Lombards' aristocracy, and helped the Lombards to regard some Italians as people of equal dignity with them. Also, the peace treaty of the year 680, with which the Byzantine Empire acknowledged the Lombard states of Italy, had contributed to this stabilization, this political stabilization. And so had the social changes linked to the peace. We know that in the last quarter of the 7th century, some Italians even joined the Lombard army, which coincided with obtaining full legal rights in the Lombard society. For the second time since the end of the Western Empire, the first time had been under King Theodoric, the possibility started to take shape that Italy became a nation joining its past of Mediterranean power with the Germanic culture dominant in the present epoch. But we will talk about that in the next lecture, with which we will enter into the 8th century. We will then discuss the apogee and the collapse of the Lombard Kingdom. Have a nice evening for now. Thank you.